It was an age of exploration. Men were pushing into uncharted lands, discovering new cultures and resources, and most importantly, clashing with other men. It was also a time when the known world was about to get a whole lot bigger. For centuries, the lands of Dorne had been a mystery to most Westerosi, spoken of only in hushed tones by those few who'd made the journey. But now, all that was about to change. Whispers began to spread through the taverns and brothels of King's Landing, carried on the wind across the narrow sea. Tales of a mighty queen, her fierce warrior husband, and a horde unlike any ever seen before. At first, these stories seemed like little more than drunken ramblings, the product of overactive imaginations and too much Dornish wine. But as the weeks passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And soon the people of King's Landing were buzzing with a fear that spread through the city like wildfire. Robert Baratheon sat heavy in his throne, the weight of the Iron Throne pressing down on him. He was a man used to crushing his enemies beneath his warhammer. But this new threat, this Dothraki horde that he could not so easily dismiss. This was a storm unlike any Westeros had ever seen. And as the winds of change began to blow, the allegiances of the great houses were about to fracture like never before. We have seen this story before. But what if the tale of the Dothraki invasion wasn't just Daenerys and a few bloodriders, but Drogo, his bloodriders, and 40,000 screaming Dothraki warriors? Drogo had no intention of following the old paths worn smooth by generations of traders and explorers. No, he wanted to make his own way to Westeros, a path of fire and blood. And as the Dothraki fleet sailed across the narrow sea, the very foundations of Westeros trembled at the thought of what was to come. The Dothraki way was a world away from the intrigues and alliances of the Seven Kingdoms. For Drogo and his people, might was right. And where their enemies fell, there was no room for mercy or negotiation. They took what they wanted and gave as little quarter as they expected. In return, this brutal, unapologetic style of leadership would be a stark and terrifying challenge to the existing power structure in Westeros. A world where kings were judged by their lineage and the intricacies of their alliances. As the tales of the approaching Dothraki horde reached King's Landing, shockwaves rippled through the Seven Kingdoms. And yet, as Drogo made landfall, Westeros was unprepared. The rulers of the Seven Kingdoms, caught off guard, scrambled to respond to this unprecedented threat. But Westeros wasn't just a land of cunning politicians and scheming nobles. The Dothraki, with their fierce horses and unbreakable bows, posed a threat unlike any Westeros had ever faced. The seasoned generals and warriors of Westeros, men who'd led armies against men, would find themselves facing an enemy whose ways were as alien to them as the deserts from which they came. Drogo had no intention of bending to the customs of Westeros, and one of their most fundamental customs was to respect stone and avoid killing inside of cities. Cities were places of learning, culture, and trade. Killing within the city walls was considered a grave offense and often led to severe penalties. But the Dothraki weren't just uncivilized barbarians. They were a proud, fiercely independent people with their own strong sense of justice and morality. So instead of trying to understand or respect the Westerosi way of life, they would force them to understand and respect theirs. But as the Dothraki poured into Westeros, the culture shock would be swift and brutal. The narrow, winding streets of Old Town, the imposing stone walls of Casterly Rock, or the towering Red Keep in King's Landing would all be met with the same disdain and contempt. Instead, they would set up camp outside the city limits, forcing the inhabitants to come to them or face the wrath of the Dothraki horde. And yet, as the Dothraki thundered across Westeros, the gears of diplomacy would turn slowly, painstakingly. Ambassadors would be sent back and forth between the Dothraki camps and the great halls of Westeros. The Dothraki demands would be simple and direct: submission or death. But the rulers of Westeros would be faced with a terrible choice. Should they try to reason with these savage invaders, or should they stand firm and fight for their way of life? In the end, the Dothraki way would be a challenge to everything Westeros stood for. Its traditions, its laws, even its very identity. And the clash between these two cultures would be nothing short of cataclysmic. When Drogo's ships first appeared on the horizon, the news spread like wildfire across Westeros, reaching the ears of the most powerful family in the Seven Kingdoms, the Lannisters. As Lord Tywin surveyed the unfolding situation, his mind raced, calculating the risks and rewards of this unexpected development. On one hand, the arrival of such a formidable force could spell disaster for Westeros. But Tywin was a master strategist, always ready with a plan. Would he see this as an opportunity to expand his family's power, or a threat to his carefully constructed world order? Perhaps his response would depend on the actions of his son, Jaime. A man who had sworn to protect the realm, but had recently broken his oath to serve the queen. Would Jaime ride to the defense of the realm or defect to the invaders? The answer could change everything. As the Dothraki horde descended upon Westeros, the North's most honorable family, the Starks, found themselves at a crossroads. Lord Eddard Stark, a man bound by duty and honor, would likely feel compelled to ride south to defend the Seven Kingdoms. But what about Winterfell? Who would protect it in his absence? Lady Catelyn Stark, known for her fierce determination and unwavering loyalty to her family and the realm, would be left to manage the family's affairs and prepare for the coming winter. The decision would weigh heavily on both their shoulders, and the consequences of their choices could impact the entire North. Meanwhile, in the sunny South, the Tyrells and Martells would face their own dilemmas. While the Tyrells, masters of political maneuvering, might throw their considerable weight behind the invaders, the Martells, with their ties to Dorne and Essos, could go either way. Each family would have to decide where their true interests lay, with the established order or with the winds of change that threatened to sweep across Westeros. At the heart of this maelstrom stood Daenerys Targaryen, a young woman who had grown up far from the intrigues of Westeros, dreaming of a world beyond the confines of her father's gilded cage. Now, as she watched Drogo lead his horde into a world she barely understood, she, too, would be forced to make difficult choices. The dragons she had brought with her, even as hatchlings, would send shockwaves throughout Westeros, seen as omens of conquest and fire. This, coupled with Drogo's battle prowess and charisma, would make them a formidable, conquering force. Yet, despite the power they wielded, Daenerys' early years in Westeros would be a delicate balancing act, trying to forge alliances and secure support while navigating the treacherous waters of courtly intrigue. For Daenerys, it would be a test of character and resolve, a challenge to reconcile her dreams of a better world with the harsh realities of power. The Dothraki invasion of Westeros wouldn't just be a clash of armies, it would be a collision of cultures, values, and ambitions. As the dust settled on each encounter, it would become clear that the fate of Westeros, and indeed the world, hung precariously in the balance. If the Dothraki had one advantage over the Westerosi, it was numbers. If they weren't able to take a castle with brute force, then they would simply lay siege to it and starve it out. With 40,000 men, even the great castles of Westeros would struggle to resist them. So let's imagine that the Lannisters, Starks, and Baratheons were wiped out, along with most of the other great houses. What would happen next? Would Daenerys take the Iron Throne? Well, perhaps not. Despite being half Targaryen, she had spent most of her life among the Dothraki, learning their ways and adopting their customs. So, if she had seized the Iron Throne, it would be as the Queen of the Dothraki, not as a Westerosi monarch. What is certain, though, is that the Seven Kingdoms would never be the same again. The scars of the Dothraki invasion would run deep, reshaping the social, political, and cultural landscape of the continent. The Dothraki, with their distinct language, customs, and traditions, would leave an indelible mark on the collective memory of Westeros. Even after their departure, their influence would continue to be felt for generations to come, shaping the course of history in ways that no one could have foreseen. Ultimately, the Dothraki invasion of Westeros would be a defining moment in the history of the world, forever altering the balance of power and leaving a legacy that would echo through the ages.